Greetings, friends. Today I want to talk to you about what the Apostle Paul writes about in Romans 5, the grace that is so much more. And I'd like to thank Joshua Tongo for being the first one to point this out to me. Now, in Romans 5:9, the Apostle Paul writes, much more than, being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. Being now justified by his blood. There it is. Much more. Well, he writes, first the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 5:1 that we're justified by faith. But here he says we're justified by his blood. So we acknowledge that we're justified by the faith and the faithfulness of Christ, which led him to the cross, which led to his bloodshed. Because grace is much more. Because grace is so much more. Romans 5:10, the Apostle Paul tells us, for if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. Much more. When were we reconciled to God? While we were still enemies. While we were still enemies, we were reconciled to God. How were we reconciled to God? Through the death of Jesus. We were reconciled to God through the death of Jesus. How are we saved? We're saved by Jesus' life. We're saved by Jesus' life because his grace is so much more. Because his grace is so much more. Now, Romans 5:15. Romans 5:15. But the free gift is not like the transgression. For if by the transgression of the one, the many died, much more, there it is, much more, did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abound to the many. Much more, because his grace is much more. The grace of God in Christ abounded much more than the sin that entered through Adam. The sin that entered through Adam, because his grace is much more. Now, Romans 5:17. Romans 5:17. For if by the transgression of the one, death reigned through the one, much more, those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. Much more, there it is. Much more, those who receive the abundance of grace. Well, yes, we have to receive the grace, but it's much harder to resist the grace of God than it is to receive it. It's much harder because his grace is so much more. Romans 5:18. The Apostle Paul writes, so then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so, through one act of righteousness, there resulted justification of life to all men. To all men. Because grace is much more. All received condemnation through the one man, Adam. The same all received justification of life through the one man, Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah. Because much more is the light of grace in and through Christ than the shadows of condemnation in Adam. Much more. Now, Romans 5:20. And I'd like to thank Steve McVeigh for helping me better understand this verse. The law came in so that the transgression would increase, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. The sin in Adam has been engulfed by the grace of God in Christ, because his grace is so much more.